1735 BC, 2160 AM. An Amorite dynasty begins in Egypt, referred to as the Hyksos kings, or foreign rulers. These were also called the Shepherd kings. The Amorites of Mitanni by this time have spread across the Fertile Crescent and occupied Syria, Canaan, and Babylonia. The invasion of the Amorite-led armies of Canaan, Babylonia, Mitanni, Philistia, and the Amalekites never conquered the interior of Egypt, but stayed in Lower Egypt, occupying Memphis and On. To the far south, Thebes of Upper Egypt remained autonomous. The Hyksos occupation established a mercantile empire and brought great prosperity to Egypt. It was the dominion of the Hyksos that led to the prominence of the Israelites in Egyptian government. The calendrics for this year are interesting. This was the 2160th year, 1080 times 2, of the Annus Mundi calendar, and 1104 years, 552 times 2, since the beginning of the Anunnaki dynasty, called the Oppression, in 2839 BC, when the 7 Nephilim kings began to rule over the Sethites in the land that would later be called Egypt. This was 1080 years after the completion of the Great Pyramid in 2815 BC in Egypt. The Egyptians were Hamitic, and this loss of Egyptian power was 500 years, 6,000 months, after Noah cursed Ham and his offspring. This occupation of Egypt was 144 years after the Battle of Kuruksata, and the East against the West in 1879 BC. Jacob and Esau were 52 years old. 1731 BC, 2164 AM. Laban, a distant relative of Jacob, fathers twin girls named Leah and Rachel. These two women destined to give birth to the first 12 tribes of Israel. This was 216 years, 108 times 2, since birth of Abraham in 1947 BC. Jacob and Esau are 56 years old, 1 Jesher. 1724 BC, 2171 AM. Isaac is 123 years old and blind. He calls Esau to him and asks him to hunt a fresh kill and cook the meat for him, so he can give him his blessing. Jacob discovers the matter and contrives to steal the blessing from Esau, feeling that he is justified because 48 years earlier, when Esau killed Nimrod and escaped the Babylonian soldiers in the Marsh, had sold his birthright to Jacob for food. Apparently Esau lied, so Jacob cooked some meat and took it into his blind father, pretending to be his brother. Isaac blessed Jacob, and Esau was enraged. Jacob flees the wrath of Esau and goes to the house of Eber, who was also a Shemite, and at 448 years old was the oldest man alive at the time of the Semitic lineage. Jacob and Esau were 63 years old, 1 Jesher. 1723 BC, 2172 AM. In this year Ishmael dies, first son of Abraham, through Hagar, an Egyptian princess. He lived for 138 years, a phoenix orbit. Jacob was 64 years when Ishmael died. This was the 1948th year of the Jewish calendar, paralleling the birth of Abraham in 1948 AM. This year was also 1380, 138 times 10 of the Vedic calendar, 1 Jesher. 1710 BC, 2185 AM. Jacob travels to his distant relative's home, Laban, and agrees to serve him for 7 years, 25-20 days, to marry Rachel, the twin of Leah, 1 Genesis. 1708 BC, 2187 AM. The ancient Eber dies at age 464, born 67 years after the flood. Eber is the origin of the term Hebrew. Jacob and Esau are 79 years old, 1 Genesis. 1703 BC, 2192 AM. Jacob, aged 84, marries both Rachel and her twin sister Leah. These women were 28 years old, and Jacob had been tricked into accepting Leah as his wife, also by her father Laban. This was 144 years since the birth of Isaac in 1847 BC, an heir to the promises of Abraham, 1 Genesis. 1697 BC, 2198 AM. Jacob is confronted with a figure that he realizes is divine, an angel or avatar of God. He wrestles with the stranger to obtain blessing from God, and in the conflict his hip is broken. The stranger awards him a new name, Israel. The change of one's name was a fundamental tenet of the elder faith, equivalent to receiving atonement, the covering of a spiritual garment. This is why the Revelation text had Christ proclaim that those who believe in him will receive a new name. Through this stranger, God promises Jacob, "And you shall have children of good character, but their multitude shall be innumerable, and they shall leave what they have to a still more numerous posterity, to whom and to whose posterity I will give dominion of all land, and their posterity shall fill the earth and sea." The tribes of Israel would multiply and become mighty and famous nations and empires. Jacob is 90 years old, or 1080 months. 1 Genesis, 2 Josephus Antiquities. 1696 BC, 21:99 AM. Jacob's beloved wife, Rachel, gives birth to Joseph at age 35. This is almost the youngest son of Jacob, and because he was from Rachel, Joseph is his most favoured son. Jacob is 91 years old. This year is 1407 of the Vedic calendar, 1407 BC being the year the Israelites inherit the land of Canaan. 1 Genesis. 1687 BC, 22:08 AM. Planet Phoenix passes through the inner system and transits directly between the orbits of Venus and Earth, darkening the Sun, completing its 138-year orbit. This visitation of Phoenix gave rise to the Bronze Age traditions of the phoenix bird immersing into the Sun every 5 centuries or so. This year was exactly one phoenix cycle of 552 years after the Great Flood. By this date, there were at least 120 million people on the planet, this being a very low approximation. In this year, Jacob was 100 years old when his daughter Dinah was abducted by a Canaanite named Shechem. She had been violated, so Jacob's mighty sons slew Shechem and the men of the city. This is the background to an extraordinary story in the book of Jasher. We find that the local Amorite overlords assembled an army of Canaanites to punish the sons of Jacob, but the patriarch prayed to God on the field of battle, and suddenly in the daytime the sun darkened, terrifying the Canaanites, followed by a terrible earthquake. The Canaanites flee, but the sons of Jacob pursue them and effect a great slaughter throughout the Canaanite cities. This was 260 years, 52 times 5, from the birth of Abraham in 1947 BC.